Greeting to Professor Dr. Salahuddin Hassan. My name is Lee Kanul and my metric number is 281817. We are from Group 18 and we are going to present our project paper, which is the relationship between tertiary education level and economic performance in Malaysia from 1991 to 2020. So now I will present the background of the study. Nowadays, education is vital in enhancing the quality of human capital that helps in economic growth. In Malaysia, our education system has three main levels, which are the primary educations, secondary educations, and tertiary educations. The government has given a huge attention to the education industry, especially on tertiary educations, because they realize the importance of education in helping to develop the human capital. The tertiary education is a third stage education level in Malaysia where students pursue after they complete their secondary education. Moving on to the next is the problem statement. Our problem statement is what are the impact of the tertiary educations to the economic performance in Malaysia. This is because as we know that the government has given a big commitment on the tertiary education. So if without knowing the impact of the tertiary education on the economy, the government and the policymakers in Malaysia might have trouble in allocating the budget and strategy in tertiary educations in our country. Our research question is, what is the relationship between the tertiary education level and economic performance in Malaysia from 1991 to 2020? These research questions will help us to determine our objective, which is to identify the relationship between tertiary education level and economic performance in Malaysia from 1991 to 2020. The next part is literature review. In this review, there will be two sections. The first section is the relationship between the education level and economic performance in other countries or regions. From the studies, we found out that most of the studies such as Asterial research in Greece and Shrewsbury research in Ireland show a substantial and positive relationship between the education level and economic performance. However, there are also some research such as Pereira research on the relationship between tertiary education and economic growth in Portugal, which show a negative relationship, and Bertoletti research which show a non-linear relationship between the education and the economic development in Europe. While for the literature review on the relationship between education level and economic performance in Malaysia, there are research show that tertiary education have positive impact to the economic growth in long run. However, there are also some research such as Sherry research which show that the tertiary education level don't have significant impact to the economic growth in Malaysia. Moving on to the next is methodology part. In our project paper, our period of study will be in between 1991 to 2020. For our econometric model, we will use the data of gross domestic product in Malaysia as the measurement of the economic performance in Malaysia, which is the dependent variable for our study. While for the tertiary education level, we will use the data of the tertiary education labor force as the independent variable in the project that affects the gross domestic product in Malaysia. However, there are also some independent variables that affect the economic performance, which is the inflation and interest rate. So we will include these independent variables in our analysis. Besides that, all of the data for this research paper is secondary data, which is collected and well organized by the third parties. The next part is analysis and discussions. There are four sections in this part, which is descriptive analysis, correlation analysis, multiple regression analysis, and diagnosis checking. So, first is descriptive analysis. Descriptive analysis is a technique applied by researchers to describe, visualize, and summarize the data into an informative way. From the table, we can find out that the mean of the GDP, tertiary education labor force, inflation rate, and interest rate are RM 675.83 billion, 2.35 million persons, 2.54%, and 6.78% respectively. Meanwhile, the median value for GDP, tertiary education's labor force, inflation rate, and interest rate are RM 570.18 billion, 2.03 million persons, 2.38%, and 6.19% respectively. The standard deviations for the GDP, tertiary education labor force, inflation rate, and interest rate are 443.25, 1.33, 1.49, and 2.26 respectively. The skewness for all variables is greater than 0, which is mean a positive skew, except for the inflation rate. Moreover, the value of quotaries for all variables is far from 3 except for inflation rate. In conclusions, GDP, tertiary education labor force, and interest rate are non-normally distributed, but the inflation rate is normally distributed because the skewness is nearly equal to 0 and the quotaries is approximately equal to 3. The next part is correlation analysis. The slideshow shows the 3 scatter plots, which is figure 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. So, firstly is the scatter plot for the GDP and the tertiary education labor force. The scatter plot shows the pattern increase from left to right. Therefore, we can conclude that there is a positive correlation between GDP and tertiary education labor force. Next, the data represented by the scatter plot show a decrease from left to right. Therefore, we can conclude that there is a negative correlation between GDP and the inflation rate. Last, which is the figure 2.3, the data represented by the scatter plot shows a decrease from left to right. Therefore, we can conclude that there is a negative correlation between GDP and interest rate also. So, for the result of correlation analysis, we can show that there are strong positive correlation for GDP with tertiary education labor force and inflation rate with interest rate because the coefficient values lies between 0.5 and 1, while GDP with interest rate, tertiary education labor force with inflation rate, and tertiary education labor force and interest rate are strongly negative correlated because the coefficient value are in the range of negative 0.5 to negative 1. And lastly, the coefficient value for GDP with inflation rate is negative 0.466, which in range of negative 0.3 to negative 0.49. So we can conclude that they are medium negative correlated. That's all from me. Thank you.
A very good day to Professor Dr. Salahuddin. My name is Lo Guan Ching and my matrix number is 277540. I will continue to present the analysis and discussion of our projects. The third analysis that we carry out is multiple regression analysis. We use ordinary least square (OLS) method to generate our regression models between GDP and tertiary education labor force, inflation, and interest rate. The regression function that we obtain is GDP equal to negative 236.081 plus 350.208 tertiary education labor force plus 21.759 inflation rate plus 4.946 interest rates plus error term. Negative 236.081 is the intercept of our regression function. It means that on average, if all independent variables are equal to 0, the predicted GDP is negative 236.081 billion ringgit. The coefficients of tertiary education labor force is 350.208, which means that if the tertiary education labor force raised by 1 million persons, as a result, the GDP increased by RM 350.208 billion. The same ideas come to inflation and interest rates. After that, we also run the individual statistic significance test using t-statistics. Based on the results of EView, the p-value of tertiary education level force and inflation rates are lower than significant level, which is 0.05. So we reject H now, and we can conclude that the tertiary education level force and inflation rate is linear relationship with GDP. In other hands, p-value of interest rate is greater than 0.05. Thus, we fail to reject H null, and we conclude that there is no relationship between interest rate and GDP. Next, we also test the overall significance of regression using F's test. The p-value of F statistics shows 0.000, which is lower than significance level 0.05. Thus, we fail to reject H null at 95% confidence levels. Thus, we can conclude that at least one coefficient in our regression is not equal to 0. Besides, coefficient determinants R squared help us to determine the goodness of fit of the regression function. The R squared value for our regression is 0.991, which means that 99.1% of GDP can be explained by tertiary education labor force, inflation rate, and interest rate. The fourth analysis in our project is diagnosis checking. One of the diagnosis checking that we have done in this project is normality test. We use Joker-Barra test, also known as JB test, to determine the residual whether they are normality distributed or not. We can calculate the value of JB using the formula shown in the slide. Here our JB value is 0.5809 with p-value 0.748. The p-value is greater than 0.05, so we fail to reject H null, and the residuals are normally distributed with mean 1.05 E minus 13. Moreover, reset test is used in specification test by expanding the model with power, namely fitted value. The figures show that results of reset test with expanding the model by one fitted value, y hat square. The coefficient of y hat square is 2.22 E minus 0.5. It is approximately equal to 0, while the p-value of F statistics is 0.7628, which is greater than significant level 0.05. Therefore, we fail to reject H null, and we can conclude that the regression is correct functional form. Other from that, we also carry out the autocorrelation test using Lagrange multiplier test. Autocorrelation problem usually happen in time series data. In this case, we assume that the current residuals is related to residuals in previous period. As you can see, the coefficient of residual -1 is 0.2102 with p-value that greater than 0.05. LM value is 0.905. The p-value change square is 0.3414, which is greater than significance level 0.05. In short, we fail to reject H null, and we can conclude that the residuals is not serially correlated. The following diagnosis checking is heteroskedasticity test. Bosch-Bagan test is applied in this test by estimating a square residual regression model as written in the slide. The computed F value is 15.6122 with p-value 0.000, which is lower than significance level 0.05. As a result, we reject HNA. The statistic is significant. We can conclude that the error terms are heteroskedastic. Moreover, we conduct the multi-collinearity test using various inflation factor VIF. There are several steps to help us to calculate VIF. The first step, we need to run the OLS model for each independent variables. Next, we calculate R square for each regression. Then we substitute R square into the VIF formula. Finally, we can detect the multi-collinearity problems based on the rule as shown in the slide. From the output of eView, the VIF for tertiary education level force, inflation rate, and interest rate are 3.782, 1.524, and 4.154 respectively. Due to all VIF values are greater than 1, so we can conclude that multi-collinearity problem exists. Since all VIF values are less than 10, so the collinearity among variables are comparatively low. From this study, we realized that the tertiary education level force has a positively relationship to the economic performance. Besides, based on our regression model, 99.1% of variation of GDP can be explained by tertiary education level force, inflation rate, and interest rate. The regression functions show no autocorrelation problem and the residuals are normally distributed. However, heteroskedasticity problem exists. This might be due to the outbreak of COVID-19 and the implementation of new technology such as 5G. Minor multi-collinearity problem exists as VIF is greater than 1 but lower than 10. As conclusion, the government and the policymakers should constantly create more opportunity for people to have high education by providing test exemption, open more community college, and put effort into supplying good educators. With a better commitment on tertiary education, the labor force from tertiary education will definitely bring a larger and positive impact to the economic performance into Malaysia at the end of the day. That's all for our project. Thank you.